Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Todd Metcalf. Spring has sprung, and for most large, publicly traded companies, it's proxy season. At annual shareholder meetings, shareholders will be voting, in person or by proxy, on issues affecting many companies. The types of issues on shareholder ballots have gone through an evolution over the past few decades, and to find out what this year's proxy season has in store, I'm pleased to be joined by Matt DiGiuseppe, a managing director in PwC's Governance Insight Center, which has just released its 2024 proxy season preview. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Todd. Given that more and more companies are holding their annual meetings virtually, it feels appropriate that I'm with you today virtually.
So, as I noted at the top, the Governance Insight Center recently released a preview of this year's proxy season. What are the key takeaways in that report?
Thanks, Todd. Yes, in our proxy season preview, we highlighted 4 key trends that we're observing in the market. The first is the continued low support for shareholder proposals. The second is an increase in hedge fund activism as the market gets used to the universal proxy rule. The third is the change in investor voting guidelines, which we'll get to in a moment. And fourth is the new disclosures. On the new disclosure front, we've actually talked about things like pay for performance, clawbacks, and the cyber rule on this program in the past, so we'll skip over that. When you look at the hedge fund activism, like I mentioned, there is a new rule around universal proxy that takes a proxy fight, which is when a third party, a hedge fund, is trying to win a board seat at the company, from what used to be a fight between competing ballots to more of a ranked choice voting system, because folks weren't sure how the market would respond or be able to accurately predict how those types of proxy fights would play out. The level of fights has been depressed for the past couple of years, but this year it seems to be the turning point where we're seeing more companies more comfortable pushing back against the hedge funds that have taken a position in their stock. In fact, we've already seen a very high-profile proxy season this year where management was successful in defending the board seats. And then on the shareholder proposal side of things, the support has really fallen off a cliff since it peaked in 2021. And it's easy to assume that that's because investors have pulled back in their support for the environmental and social topics that frequently drive the proposals that are being voted on. But in reality, what we've noticed is that there are a number of trends we highlight in our paper that are all coming together to suppress that support, rather than it being necessarily a change in expectations from shareholders around ESG topics.
So, anyone who has paid any attention at all to corporate governance recently is familiar with 3 letters: ESG. ESG has been a big item in recent proxy seasons, but the issue seems to be going through some rebranding. While companies are taking steps to avoid regulatory scrutiny or political criticism, we're also seeing corporate reports and executive titles dropping the use of ESG. What has prompted this change from the corporate perspective, and is there also a shift in using ESG from the investor side? And is that shift in language indicative of a shift in action?
Yes, Todd, ESG is certainly 3 letters that have a lot of different meanings. And I think to understand sort of where the market's going in terms of the language that's being used, it's important to start with, some of the origin, which was really ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Its origin is investors and companies were looking for a way to better communicate about the factors outside of the financial statement that contribute to success and sustainability of an organization. We all know they exist. There's a common understanding that human capital and the quality of employees contribute to a company's profits, right? How the company manages material externalities, for instance, climate risk or its supply chain, matter to the company's success and financial sustainability. But there wasn't really a methodology to talk about that collective group of important factors together. And so ESG emerged as a way for investors and companies to talk about all of these factors that we know contribute to success and sustainability, but didn't really have the terminology to do so. And then more recently, because some of these factors are hot button topics in public and political discord, the term ESG has also been used to talk about that political and public side of some of these factors, I think to the detriment of really where the investor and corporate community were trying to go with their communications initially. And so what you see is a pullback from necessarily using this term to talk about these collective factors to talking about the factors specifically that you're discussing. So rather than saying ESG to talk about climate, you're talking about climate and climate resiliency and transformation and how the company is managing those risks. Rather than using ESG to talk about human capital or diversity, equity, and inclusion, companies are talking about how they think leaning into diversity, equity, and inclusion contributes to the success of the organization overall. And you see that also showing up in investors' voting guidelines. I mentioned that, it's one of the key trends that we're watching. Rather than talking about these topics collectively, right? You've seen a trend in the past couple of years where the investor voting guidelines are addressing climate resiliency or human capital, and they're recognizing that these issues show up for different companies in different ways and need to be addressed appropriately given the sector size, industry, and all of those other factors. And so I actually think ESG as a term has served its purpose, and you see sort of this fight in the market to move past it, because out of having that large umbrella term, the lexicology and the ability to talk about these specific risks has evolved so that investors and companies can communicate consistency clearly around those factors. So it's actually, a big takeaway is that ESG probably isn't the best way to be talking about some of these factors today. And it certainly is, how investors are voting.
So Matt, there's a lot of noise in the market and there are conflicting signals coming from shareholders. How are boards and executives working through the noise to find the real direction coming from their investors?
So you just asked me probably the hardest question, and this might be the very easiest question, which is that investors and board members and executives are talking to each other and having a dialogue. Engagement's the term of art in the industry. But it's really, finding that opportunity to hear directly from investors about what's important to them and what matters to them in the context of each individual company. Again, going back to no longer talking about ESG being an agenda item, but which are the elements under that sort of umbrella that are most important to have a dialogue around, because that's really how you're going to work through the noise to get to what really matters. And I think that's actually the positive place I'll leave this, which is what really matters hasn't necessarily changed over the course of the past couple of years. It's just how we've talked about it. And I think that's a benefit to everybody.
Well, thank you, Matt, for sharing those insights into this year's Proxy season.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
For our viewers, you can find the Governance Insight Center's 2024 Proxy Season preview in the description of this episode. And thank you, as always, for joining us. We'll see you next time.